Hello again on this lovely early spring day. Are there any questions about last time's work, stuff that concerned you? Very good. Now, in my narrative of Indian history, we left off basically with the last of the three waves of Muslim conquest. At the beginning of the 16th century, a new wave of Turkish invaders coming from Afghanistan, actually from Central Asia, invaded and relatively quickly established what was called the Mughal Empire. And the Mughal Empire, the dates are basically 1526 to 1757. The Mughal Empire was founded by an individual. Let me bring that up. By the name of Babur. He's the first Mughal emperor, and he claimed that he was a direct descendant of the great Mongol and Central Asian conquerors, Genghis Khan and Tamerlane, who dominated most of Central Asia and indeed China in the 13th and 14th centuries.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks, Jeff.
Well, Babur was the conqueror, but the empire was actually consolidated and it crystallized in the latter part of the 16th century under the rule of Akbar, who was considered the greatest of the Mughal emperors, 1556 to 1605. And in our account of the Mughal Empire, we'll be concentrating on the reign of Akbar. Now, I want to say before I carry forward with this discussion that, of course, from the 12th century onwards, most of India, the north and the center, were dominated by the Muslims. But it's important to sort of reiterate the fact that during the Dark Ages, which had preceded, from 600 to roughly 1200, there had been this kind of consolidation at the local level of Hindu civilization. And the Hindus, following the conquests of Muhammad of Ghor, were subordinated to the Muslims. The Muslims were the rulers over most of north and central India. But one should remember that it's during this dark age when, in fact, towns, monies, commerce largely disappeared, and there were only small kingdoms over most of India. It's during this period that Hindu civilization consolidated itself. The rule of the Brahmins at the top of society, with their control of the religious life, um, the their control over local offices, um, and the fact that they were at the top of the caste system, which now fully consolidated itself during this period, became permanent, with the Brahmins at the top, the landlord warriors next, then the farmers below them, and finally the outcasts, the Dalits. This system of caste, where you could not intermarry, and the system was permanent, hereditary, and which still persists, obviously in an adulterated form, but is still, especially in neoliberal India, it still is a factor. And one should also note the existence alongside the Brahmins, or the sort of military caste known as the Rajputs, who are sort of, they back up the Brahmins. And finally, that this whole setup is, of course, based on the villages, which were essentially isolated one from another. There were no towns and cities. You have essentially a barter economy at the local level, where artisans exchange their furniture, the pottery, for food from the peasant villagers. And I would say that the system worked basically on the basis of this localized, autonomous, isolated village autonomy, and the villagers as a whole had to pay basically tribute, if you like, rent to the upper castes in the society, and eventually, when the state central sort of reemerged, they had to pay tribute to the central government. But these villages, as I say, were where the great majority lived, were essentially isolated. In a setup like this, where you have this kind of an economy at the local level, and you have this caste system, and eventually you have a state on top of that, we call that kind of a system the Asiatic mode, And in this system, really, it's obviously a stratified setup, but there are no real economic classes.
Professor,
And it's a society that is essentially static. And as I said last time, Gandhi thought it was a good setup. Who needs progress was his view. But others, like liberal economists and certainly Karl Marx, were critical because Marx in particular held that a class system and the sort of clash between the different classes gave society a certain dynamic, and there was no real dynamic in this system, according to him. In terms of Indian history, the significance of all this is that this deeply entrenched local system, including the religious culture, allowed Hinduism to not only persist, but to endure through the whole period of Muslim rule. So that's why I sort of wanted to reiterate that. Now, in terms of the course of this Mughal Empire, we can say that under Akbar and his successors, virtually all of India was unified under the control of the Mughal Empire. Remember last time I told you that there was a big Hindu state toward the south in India, known as the Vishnanagara Kingdom. Well, this was, in the course of the 17th century, was conquered by the Mughal Empire. And part of the reason why it was able to conquer was from the 16th century onwards, like the Ottoman Empire, the Mughals had cannon and rifles at their disposition. So the Mughal army was strong. And as I said, in the 17th century, they were able to fully consolidate their control over India. Now, the setup as it was consolidated but incidentally, are there any questions about what I've said?
Professor?
Okay. The setup established by Akbar and which persisted during the whole of the Mughal period was, of course, there was a court at Delhi. This was a carryover from the Delhi Sultanate. There was a court, but the first tier of control over the Mughal Empire beyond the emperor or below the emperor were the so-called Mansabdars, the Mansabdars. And the Mansabdars were basically the generals of the Mughal army, which was vast, as many as 400,000 men in this Mughal army. And most of the I should say about a third of the generals were basically Turks who were descended from the original conquest of Babar. But there were also Mansabdars who were Persians, because there were close connections between the Mughal Empire and the Persian Empire. And a lot of Persian warriors came down and joined the Mughals in ruling over India. And so alongside them, the Turkish Mansabdars, there were also Persians. And the last element, we could say another third, consisted of Muslim aristocrats, but also even Hindu aristocrats who were held over from the period of the Delhi Sultanate. So the Mansabdar elite was composed of both Turks, Persians, and Muslims and Hindus from the old Delhi Sultanate. And their basic function was military, trying to conquer the rest of India, but also holding the rest of the population, of course, under control. But they also, some of the leading Mansabdars were also given assignments as governors over the various regions of India. And I would say that these people were, alongside the emperor, were enormously rich. We can't even imagine the wealth that accrued to this this Mansabdar class, because basically with the consolidation of this Mughal empire under Akbar, the tribute from the hundreds of thousands of Indian villages flowed from the villages up into the Mansabdar class and ultimately into the hands of the emperor. And so the surpluses that were taken from the peasantry were enormous. And it's estimated that 3/5 of the surplus, the economic surplus after the subsistence of the peasants, 3/5 of the surplus fell into the hands of the emperor and the Mansabdars. And this, of course, provided the basis for enormous luxury consumption. That's the first thing to say. The second thing that one should mention is that, as I've already suggested, the Indian elite had close connections with Persia. There was a close and ongoing connection. There was free trade, and ultimately also with the Ottoman Empire. Across this vast region of the Middle East and Central Asia, this is essentially a free trade zone. Another aspect of this Mughal Empire is that they had contacts with the Portuguese. The Portuguese remained in control of Goa and several other cities along the coast. And the Mughal Emperor, Akbar in particular, allowed this to continue. He could have easily conquered, but the trade with the West was convenient and even lucrative. And so the Portuguese were allowed to remain. And as I explained to you, the Goa and some of these towns, they persisted over the decades and generations. And the Catholic Portuguese elite intermarried with some of the richer merchants from the higher caste in Goa. And these Indians became Catholic. Catholicism continues to this day to have a presence in India, and it stems from these Portuguese enclaves on the west coast of India. Now, speaking a little bit more about Akbar, as it said, he was a powerful ruler. This was a very strong state, and of course, there were enormous amounts of money available for luxury consumption. As a result, on the part of Akbar and the Mansabdar class. But Akbar was he's still in a way venerated in India because, as it turned out, he was a tolerant ruler. He was intellectually curious. He was a great patron of the arts. And because he knew that there were, of course, Hindus in India, and there were also Christians, he actually invited Hindus and Christians to the court. And he set up religious debates between the Christians, the Hindus. He even invited some Jews, and there were these interesting debates about which was the true religion. And he took this a step further in the sense that he began to speak about a kind of monotheistic divine cult, which could be inclusive of all of the religions of India. Now, this is a very interesting and indeed extraordinary thing for a Muslim ruler to do. It contrasts very sharply with the intolerance of the Sultan in in Istanbul. And I think one of the main reasons for this was that he was trying to assert his independence from the Muslim leaders, the religious leaders, the imams, the ulemas, these religious leaders who were notably intolerant. And so setting up this kind of divine cult independently of the Muslim clergy was a way of strengthening his own power, but at the same time, it it helped to consolidate the Mughal state. One last thing I should say is that India's exports to the West were growing, as you'll see, especially textiles, and we'll mention that in a few minutes. The West basically had, that is to say, Western Europe and so on. Of course, it was interested in the spices, in the luxury goods, in the textiles that India produced, but it didn't really have very much that the Indians wanted. And essentially, the West had to send gold, obviously from Spain, from Spanish America, but also they sent guns and cannons. And also the Indians were also interested in the clocks and watches that the Westerners also produced. But that isn't really very, in terms of manufactured goods, it's not very much. So essentially, India sent its luxury products, especially textiles, to the West, and the West essentially sent weapons and some mechanical devices to India, and that was the extent of Western influence. Now, I wish to, just a second. To come back to this whole question of the luxury consumption of the court and of the Mansabdars, who had so much of the surplus. Obviously, maintaining this huge army was a vast expense. Certainly, they spent a lot of the surplus on that, but they also, as I explained, there was this luxury consumption. And one of the areas where the most striking areas where this went on were the building of monumental temples. I'm talking about mosques. I'm talking about tombs. I'm talking about palaces and forts. And all over, particularly northern India, there are literally hundreds and hundreds of these forts and palaces and temples, mosques and tombs, which are strikingly beautiful because based on Turkish, based on Persian examples, this very distinctive Muslim Mughal architecture developed from the 16th century onwards. And we see here 4 examples of this. And of course, the greatest of these, the most beautiful of these, considered the masterpiece, is the famous Taj Mahal, which was built during the 17th century by a successor to Akbar, an emperor. And as a matter of fact, even Italian architects were brought in to build this magnificent building. But as I say, it's just one of literally hundreds of magnificent examples of this Mughal architecture. And in addition to the architecture that we see, we should also note that here, I need to a certain style of painting developed in the Mughal court and amongst the aristocrats. A lot of it was miniature painting, but there is a quite sort of interesting, greatly influenced by Persia again. Persian cultural influence is very strong. A certain very today, these pieces are extremely valuable. So there was a whole, just like, of course, in Europe, we have Renaissance and Baroque art. There was this Mughal art that's quite important, and we can say is a Mughal achievement. And I also want to note the fact that not only did they do painting, but also there was as well, there was a great tradition, again, Persian influence in writing, beautiful writing. Writing was considered an art, and it's which was never true in true in the West. Oh, sorry, that's not correct. The medieval monks also made a great thing of beautiful handwriting, but especially because of the influence of the Quran, writing was greatly prized. And we see a similar thing in China, as we'll discover a little bit later. So we have this beautiful writing as well. You see, it's almost like an abstract design. Calligraphy, this is called. And the last thing I want to mention in terms of their cultural life is their textiles. A fantastic production of luxury textiles, as well as carpets by the Mughals. And you combine this with this architecture, with the rugs, the furniture, the armor. There is a fantastic sort of luxurious consumption, similar to what went on amongst the Ottomans, but I think the Indian achievement is even more impressive. And as I said before, the influence of Persia is very important. And as a matter of fact, the Persian language was the official language of the court. The Persian cultural influence was so strong that, in fact, the court and the Mansabdar class tended to speak in Persian rather than in a Indian vernacular language. One thing more I want to say about all of this is that obviously it was the Indian elite who were the patrons of this art, who, because of their vast incomes, basically patronized and sort of created this art, this style of consumption, and is considered one of the great achievements of world culture. And we do see that if we look at the Aztecs or we look at the Incas, if we look at Western Europe, or for that matter, Eastern Europe, we see that it's the upper class, and often it's the religious, the institutionalized religion, which becomes the inspiration, if you like, for cultural life, is the patron of the great art, and essentially is the consumer. And if we look at this art, we see it from the perspective of the ruling class. If we look at the Taj Mahal, we're very impressed. This emperor built this great temple. But what we have to remember in this case, and in the case of all the other civilizations and cultures that we're doing, that without denying the fact that the upper classes have taste, nevertheless, it was craftsmen, artisans, workers who actually produced this art. It's all, if you look at this, for the thing, this beautiful textile, it was actually spinners and weavers who actually executed this thing. And what we have in all of the civilizations that we're mentioning, and we're particularly using this example, we could use European examples, or we could look at the Aztecs, is the fact that underneath the upper class is the reality of these workers, these craftsmen, who develop under the patronage, admittedly, of the upper class. This was a fantastic level of skill. That is a very important aspect of what I'm talking about. Now, the supply of these luxury goods to the upper class in Indian society, to the court and to these noblemen, the Mansabdars, required a large, ultimately in the cities, which grew under Mughal rule, a large class of merchants and craftsmen all over India, large towns, which produced luxury products, textiles, furniture, carpets, in substantial workshops. Some of the workshops were actually, some Mansabdar would basically set up a manufacturing establishment to produce textiles that he wanted. But more often than not, it was merchants, who set up these manufacturing establishment workshops. We can call them proto-factories, if you like, with hundreds of workers. Or else these merchants would go out into the countryside, to around the cities, and basically in what is called the putting out system, there would be spinners and weavers living in the villages, and they would commission them to sort of spin and weave these textiles. And the merchant class in India, of course, became very large. It was made up, of course, of Hindus and Muslims, but also you do find that people from Goa, Armenians, and even Jews participated in this commerce and manufacturing, which largely catered to the upper classes in Indian society. And the same merchants would also loan money to the mansabdars, to the landlords, to the upper caste, the landed caste. Certain trade, banking and usury developed in Indian society at the same time. But we have to remember that, in fact, beyond this, especially the textile industry became extremely important because the Indians, in terms of textile production, they produced a whole variety of textiles, including silks, muslins, and above all, cotton goods. I want to underline that, cotton goods, which were not only were beautifully made, but also found an export market to the rest of Asia. And indeed, increasingly, as the West European elites became more and more wealthy, they began to become attracted to Indian cotton goods. Indian cotton goods, by the late 17th and first part of the 18th century, became a rage in Western Europe. It became the biggest part of the trade between the Europeans and the Indians. The Indians were manufacturing millions of yards of cotton goods and exporting them to Europe. Of course, increasing the trading deficit with Europe. Europe had to come up with more and more gold because the demand for Indian cotton goods became so enormous. And we will see that this reality had a big bearing on ultimately on the Europeans themselves going into the business of cotton manufacturing. With this difference, the Europeans in the 18th century began to mechanize cotton production. And this mechanization became the basis of what we'll see later came to be called the Industrial Revolution in Europe. It made an enormous difference. So that gives you a overall sense of things at a certain level. But now let's get back to the narrative. And so at the top, I've made the point that the mansabdars were the ruling class, certainly at the national level. But of course, there was still the local level. And it was from the local level that the tribute that went up to the mansabdars and to the emperor came. And it was a kind of local aristocracy who went by the name zamindars. There are the mansabdars, and at the local level, the local collectors of the tribute for the upper class and for the emperor were the so-called zamindars. So who were these zamindars who were in contact with the peasant villages down below? Well, they're precisely the people who had dominated the villages for centuries. That is to say, the Brahmins, the Rajputs, and maybe some rich peasants. They constituted the local elites. For the most part, they were Hindus. But we have to remember that because of the Muslim conquests, some of them were of Muslim origin. But these were, the zamindars were the ones who directly pumped surplus out of the villages into the hands of the zamindars. Now, I would say two things about this. First of all, I would reiterate the fact that there was as time wore on, more and more of what the peasants produced was extracted from them. The level of exploitation grew over time. And of course, as I've explained, most of it went up to the top. But as time wore on, the zamindars at the local level, they developed an increasing consciousness of their own interests. And they began to sort of rival, they began to oppose the excessive demands of the mansibdars and the court. So we have overexploitation, and in the middle of this, the elites at the local level begin to conflict with the upper class and the court. And I would say, in terms of the ultimate decline of the Mughal Empire, which happened, of course, in the 18th century, from an economic point of view, it is overexploitation, taking too much from the peasants, and this happened in the Ottoman Empire too, we see. And secondly, growing rivalry between the zamindars and the mansabdars led to open conflict between these two groups and accelerated decline. And of course, the zamindars had nothing like the power of these mansabdars, who had huge armies at their command. But what the zamindars had was contact with the local villagers. And as we'll see in a little while, they began to organize opposition to the upper classes in the villages, both Hindu and Muslim opposition to the upper class and the court. Are there any questions about what I've said? Well, what about this opposition? Where did it come from? Obviously, there were these underlying social and economic grievances which got worse and worse as time wore on because there was so much exploitation. But the opposition developed out of religion. It came out of religion. And of course, that is so characteristic of Indian culture, because if there's one thing I emphasized from the beginning was that Indian culture, Hindu and Muslim, it's all about religion. And so, sure enough, of course, the religion was formally controlled by the Muslim elite and by the Brahmins, but from below, from particularly the craftsmen and amongst the peasants, there slowly emerged religious opposition to the whole sort of not only religious, but political kind of construct of the Mughal Empire. And this opposition religion, which began in the 16th century, is known as bhakti, And so we want to discuss what this bhakti consisted of. It's interesting and notable, and it's certainly comparable, that this bhakti opposition developed at the beginning of the 16th century, in the same way that Luther's revolution against the Catholic Church, Protestantism, develops at the beginning of the 16th century. So we see this religious opposition developing in India at the beginning of the 16th century. And we could say the first and most famous of the dissident religious leaders was a man by the name of Kabir. Kabir, his date of death is 1518. And significantly, Kabir was not a Brahmin. He was a weaver by trade. He was a common person. He was a craftsman. He worked with his hands. And similarly, we see that the other leaders of this Bhakti movement, we could name, one of them was a calico printer, printed designs on textiles. Another was a barber. Another was a cotton carder, helped to manufacture cotton. Another one was actually a scavenger, made his living by basically picking at the garbage. And there was also, we should note that one of these leaders was a man by the name of Nanak, active in the Punjab, and he is the founder of Sikhism. So we have this grassroots movement. And significantly, in terms of this religion, instead of sort of looking at the Sanskrit text of Hinduism, all of these religious leaders spoke the language of the people. They spoke in the vernacular language, so other people, the common people, could understand what was being said by these religious leaders. They rejected Brahmanism. They rejected caste. These Bhakti leaders were monotheists. They believed in one God, whereas the Brahmins spoke about many gods. They were polytheists. They preached a kind of simple ethical faith. They based on the communication between the individual and this monotheistic God. And so you can see there is a diametrical opposition between this kind of religion and the basically the dominant Hindu religion. And of course, it also, in a certain way, cuts against Islam as well. We should say that the thing is that there's no doubt that this religious movement was anti-elite and anti-state, but because of the overwhelming influence of religion, the Bhakti movement basically organized itself in terms of heretical sects rather than in terms of a class opposition. The issue of class, which emerged clearly in Western Europe in the 14th and 15th century, and we'll see was real in the case of the Chinese Empire. Real economic classes, real class war existed in China and in the West. In India, on the contrary, what you have is sectarian movements which reject the existing state, the institutionalized religion, but never quite crystallized into a class movement. Well, we'll continue this discussion, which of course leads to essentially the decline of the Mughal Empire on Monday. And we'll also get into the review question.